thank you everybody for showing up I guess wherever you are. If you're in the US, it is very early in the morning, so I appreciate your getting up on a Saturday morning to be with me. Here it's just after midday, so not quite so ungodly an hour. So I'm really excited to be with you. I was just saying to the panel before we went live that I'm a little bit gutted that SASH is not happening in person this year, because it's been a really important part of my own professional development, but I'm excited to be able to join you anyway, and maybe even connect with some people outside of the usual attendance. Please do follow along in the chat with me. I really enjoy that kind of audience participation. It's not so easy to do online, so please do feel free to write something in the chat if I've explained something and you haven't understood what I'm trying to say. If something really resonates for you and you're like, yes, that makes sense, I love to just kind of hear that from you, and I'll check in with the chat as we go along. So it would be actually really interesting for me, just as a starting place, to know what brings you here, because I know that these sessions are open to practitioners as well as to the general public, and so I've tried to pitch what I'm going to share with you today at a level that will resonate for you if you're on your own journey of healing after betrayal, whether that's as the person who's been betrayed or the person who has done the betrayal, or if you're a practitioner. So hopefully I'll kind of hit that mark for you as we go through. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and what I'm going to share with you today. So the title of the presentation is Love Hurts, Forgiveness After Betrayal. In terms of the work that I do, you can see on the screen here, my name's Kat Etherington. I'm Head of Recovery with Naked Truth Project. Naked Truth Project is a UK-based but internationally operating charity. We aim to open eyes and free lives from the damaging impact of pornography, and we do that in those two stages. We do awareness and education work, which is our open eyes. We want to start conversations about the issues of pornography, problematic sexual behaviors, sexualization in culture, those kinds of topics. And so we have schools team who are talking to young children and teenagers about the impact of sexualized media, and we do kind of community sessions, parent workshops, all sorts of stuff in our education and awareness, as well as sort of creative campaigns to start those conversations in our communities. The work that I do is over in the kind of free lives section, which is Naked Truth Recovery, where we are operating programs for people who are trying to overcome problematic sexual behaviors and heal from the impact of those behaviors within a relationship. So that's what I'm doing day in, day out, as a certified professional life coach, a student in integrative counselling, and a bunch of other additional bits and pieces, most notably for this presentation as a certified partner coach with the Association for Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. That is the organisation we know as APSATS. So that's a little bit about me. I will share with you at the end of the presentation a little bit more about what we offer at Naked Truth Recovery, which is a fully online recovery program for people seeking healing and wholeness after either a problematic sexual behavior of their own or after a problematic sexual behavior has impacted their life in some other way. So I'll tell you some more about that as we go through and at the end. So please do follow, as I said, in the chat. If you've got a question, put it in the Q&A, and so that way it doesn't disappear up the chat as we go and we won't miss it. So yeah, that should be enough in terms of housekeeping for you to feel like you know a little bit about me and who I am. So I'm going to be sharing with you today on the topic of forgiveness after betrayal. And I kind of come to this topic recognizing that for those of you who work with partners, you might already know that this can be a controversial topic. And partly that's why I chose to talk about it, because I think it's really important that we are willing to go into those places that feel a little bit uncomfortable and a little bit messy. And so having worked with partners practitioners for a good number of years now, I started to understand that forgiveness really is a topic that my clients want to be talking about. And I work with couples too, so you know it's obviously an important topic that comes up as part of that relational recovery piece. And so because my clients are wanting to talk about it, it seemed only right and appropriate that we should be talking about it. And I also recognized as a practitioner that I have sort of my own beliefs and values and thoughts and feelings around the topic of forgiveness. And so I really wanted to sort of challenge myself to step outside of my own understanding and my own kind of frame of reference and get into something that was a little bit more tangible. So I went off and did some research, not my own research. I kind of reviewed the research that was out there. And what I discovered was that there is a ton of super interesting research on the topic of forgiveness. So I pulled together the bits that I thought were most interesting to share with my clients. And so I brought them to SASH, thinking that if I found them interesting and applicable for the work that I am doing, the likelihood is that other practitioners would also value hearing some of what I learned. And likewise for people who are journeying recovery after betrayal or problematic sexual behavior, it would be interesting for them too. So I hope that you will find this interesting. Like I said, I'm kind of trying to contextualize what I've learned about this topic within the work that I do. Just to be transparent, the work that I do is predominantly with female partners and male perpetrators. And so kind of just being aware that when I'm using language, it's probably going to reflect my demographic. I'm going to trust that you can make those translations as appropriate. Just reading in the chat, I'm here looking to understand if there is more forgiveness on my end after 30 years of secret betrayal and just getting to the attachment disorder intimacy issue. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing what brought you along, because you've gotten up early probably to be here today. So I appreciate getting a feel for what is it that people are hoping to gain from this presentation. So here's what I need to tell you in terms of disclosures, which is that I have no disclosures and I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So we're all good in that respect. Over the next 75 minutes-ish, depending on how much I end up talking, here's what we're going to take a look at together. So I'm going to start off, and anyone who's done any presentation work with me before knows that I always start with a definition. So I'm going to start off looking at some of the dictionary definitions and some of the more kind of colloquial definitions of forgiveness. So we're going to look at what forgiveness is, and then we're going to look at what forgiveness is not, because I think it's really important that we are clear about what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. And then I want to unpack what I learned from the research. And in a minute, I'm going to show you a slide with all of the different studies that I've pulled from. But the main study that I've pulled from is one that kind of unpacks this idea of forgiveness aversions. So I'm going to spend a good bit of time looking at the common barriers to forgiveness and how they show up in a recovering relationship. And then I'll offer some of my thoughts and ideas on how we might overcome some of those barriers and help to move towards forgiveness, if that is a thing that we choose to move towards. And I always put a disclaimer on this presentation, which is that what I'm not trying to do is convince anybody that they need to forgive anybody. What I am going to try to do is invite you to start to think about what forgiveness might mean for you, if that is something that you are open to considering and would like to pursue, which, as I've said already, is the case for many of my clients. And as a practitioner, what I hope that you will get from what I'm going to share with you is, like I said, some sort of tangible anchor points where you can say, okay, there is actually some research that is helpful here, that provides an external frame of reference for this topic. And then at the end, I'll tell you more about what we do at Naked Truth Recovery, in case you want to know more. So in terms of kind of the starting place, we want to look at this idea of motivational ambivalence. And what I'm going to hope to answer for you, and you'll see how this is represented visually throughout the presentation, is what's in the balance in terms of ambivalence towards motivation for forgiveness. And so I'm going to anchor us in as we go through with this kind of picture of scales showing how we are balancing off these different motivations and how that impacts the journey to forgiveness. Let me just move the chat box out of my own way so I can see what I'm doing. And just to kind of position that, I pulled this quote from the research to kind of set the scene for the whole conversation. So one of the pieces of research suggested that forgiveness at any given moment can seem an attractive or unattractive option. And victims, that is the person who may need to forgive or may want to forgive, often feel an ongoing ambivalence and an internal conflict about giving and maintaining forgiveness. And even here, we're starting to see some stuff about how we might define forgiveness, because they're talking about giving forgiveness, which kind of feels like almost a one-off event or a thing that happens at a moment in time. But they're also talking about maintaining forgiveness, which almost sounds like forgiveness could be lost. And I guess it could be lost through a secondary offense, another offense, or maybe even because the motivation of the client choosing to forgive is changing. And so I guess I just want to highlight that and have you bear that in mind as we go through the barriers, because you'll see that sometimes those barriers can reappear even after forgiveness has been offered. So we're going to specifically look at motivational ambivalence and how that shows up in the topic of forgiveness. So just because I wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence, here are the main sources from which I have pulled my research. Maybe we can send you some of these study references, actually, because if you are interested in research around this, there is a whole ton of information in these resources that I could have spent a week talking about. So I've just tried to pull out the most important pieces. In terms of the place I'm pulling most of my information from, it's this 1 second from the bottom on forgiveness aversion, which is about developing a motivational state. So really fascinating research, and just wanted to make sure if I don't reference it properly later on that I made sure that everybody knew where I got my stuff from. So let's start right at the beginning and look at some definitions for forgiveness. So what do we actually mean when we talk about forgiveness? So I usually go to the English dictionary first because I am English. So I went to the Cambridge Dictionary and this was the definition offered there. So forgiveness is to stop blaming or being angry with someone for something that that person has done, or to not punish them for something. So I thought, okay, that's a reasonable definition. Let's see what Merriam-Webster has to say in the American dictionary, the American English dictionary. So Merriam-Webster defined forgiveness as to cease to feel resentment against an offender. So you can see already there's this sort of letting go of a negative emotion, whether it's anger or resentment, to give up resentment of or claim to, I'm not sure if you say that, requital or requital, I think requital, and to grant relief from payment, so to forgive a debt, right? So if there was money involved, that might be what it means to forgive in that situation. So to stop feeling negative feelings is kind of the implicit message in the dictionary definitions, and they talk about forgiving, giving up resentment. And then I thought, well, loads of people have written about forgiveness over the years, and so I did a quick kind of Google search to see what's out there on the internet in terms of how we might define forgiveness. And in particular, I tried to pull together a whole bunch of stuff from the research, because there was, for as many studies as there were slightly different definitions of what it might mean to forgive. So instead of sharing all the millions of them that I found with you, what I've tried to do is pull together a single sentence that captures the essence of what I was seeing in the research. And I've chosen these pictures here because they really converged on this idea of letting go. And so this is the definition that I felt captured the heart of what I was reading. So many psychologists contend that forgiveness involves a conscious decision, whilst acknowledging the seriousness of the wrong, to release or forego bitterness and vengeance. And again, this is reflecting that idea that forgiveness is about releasing, it's about letting go of some negative emotions. What I thought was interesting about this definition, and again, the sort of multiple ways that this was reflected in the research, was this suggestion that forgiveness is a conscious decision. This idea that maybe it's an intentional process, which was just an interesting one to me, because that is borne out in some of the studies and it is contended in some of the studies. So I would love to hear your experience of that. I know we sometimes hear people talking about making a decision to forgive and choosing to engage in that process. So that was definitely there in the research. And then I wondered about some of the conventional wisdom, and I found quotes from Brene Brown, who's spoken a lot about forgiveness. I found some quotes from Oprah that were also really, really interesting in terms of how they were talking about forgiveness. Stuff about forgiveness being more about the person choosing to forgive than about the person who'd committed the offense. Stuff about forgiveness being less altruistic than it might first seem. So there's lots of different definitions of forgiveness out there, and I think and I'll continue to share some of those with you, but I think it can be important for us to consider, what do we mean when we're talking about forgiveness, either for ourselves or when we're interpreting this word forgiveness as we hear it from our clients, because already we can see that it can mean different stuff. Let me just contextualize what I'm talking about within the multidimensional partner trauma model of APSATS, because what I also think you're going to see today is how the APSATS trauma model for working with partners of sex addicts or betrayed women, or betrayed men for that matter, really lines up nicely with what I found in the research. So I just wanted to nod back to this in case you needed a reminder or you had never seen it before. So in APSATS, we use a 3-stage trauma resolution model, which is safety and stabilization in stage 1, remembering and mourning in stage 2, and reconnection in stage 3. And I wanted to flash this up for you because when we get to talking about forgiveness aversions, you're going to see how actually these could overlay one another really quite well. And so this is the place in this presentation where I usually stick my flag in the ground and say that where I come out on the topic of forgiveness, which is not where everybody comes out, is that it's kind of my belief that when you journey healing from relational trauma or betrayal trauma, forgiveness is kind of an outcome. And I know that you could find people who would say that forgiveness is a pathway to healing or a doorway to healing. And I think I would sit on the other end of that spectrum and say that in my experience and what I believe is borne out in the research is that that healing leads to forgiveness for many people. And so you'll see how I've kind of drawn that conclusion when I start to unpack the research. So just a nod to that, and you'll see, and I'll tie that in as we go through. So let's talk about what forgiveness isn't, because this is also important. And I know that one of the controversies around this topic of talking about forgiveness with partners is that often partners feel like there is a pressure to forgive and forget, to move on and never talk about something ever again. And so I thought it was really important to be talking about what forgiveness is not, as well as defining what it is. So in terms of what I think this was reflected in pretty much all of the research, that forgiveness is not about these things. So we're not going to assume that forgiveness and trust are mutually inclusive principles, that you can forgive without restoring trust. And so those are two things that are completely separate for some people. Forgiveness is not a denial of the offense. And of course, you heard that in the definition I gave a few minutes ago. So what we're not saying is that we forgive, we forget, we pretend like it never ever happened. And so it's important to acknowledge that. So again, it's not forgetting. So it's not denying and pretending it never happened. And it's not forgetting and never ever talking about that thing again. Forgiveness is not necessarily linked to reconciliation. One of the most interesting pieces of wisdom I heard from somebody, which is so simple and blunt on the topic of forgiveness, was when somebody said to me, "You can forgive from a different address." And I thought that was just a simple but profound piece of wisdom, that forgiveness and reconciliation do not necessarily have to go hand in hand. So I can let go of negative feelings towards a person without choosing to stay in relationship with that person. And forgiveness is also, finally, not a thumbs up. It's not a message that says, I'm okay with what you did and I condone that in any way. And so I think it's just important to consider what forgiveness is not, alongside considering what forgiveness is. And I'll talk in a minute about how we might work with clients to consider their definitions of forgiveness. But before that, let's see what Oprah and Brene have to say. Because, of course, some of the places that our clients are drawing their ideas about forgiveness is from a good old internet meme. And so I thought it would be worth putting up some of the ones that I've seen doing the rounds on the internet. So here we have Brene, who says, forgiveness is not forgetting or walking away from accountability or condoning a hurtful act. It's the process of taking back and healing our lives so that we can truly live. So here you've got this idea of forgiveness really being about healing me, so not rather than releasing the other person, which I think is interesting. Oprah, I used to work with a guy who had an Oprah quote for every occasion. So Oprah has become a bit of a go-to for me. So she says, forgiveness is giving up the hope that the past could have been any different. And that is one that often resonates for my client and my clients. And it kind of speaks to that, that moving on and coming to terms with the past, which is something we are going to talk about a little bit too. More Brene, she says, to forgive is not just to be altruistic. It is the best form of self-interest. And again, this is a really appealing message for some of my clients, that I'm not forgiving the other person for them, but I'm doing it for myself and for my healing. And that can be a really helpful starting place for some of us with forgiveness, because sometimes it doesn't feel like we want to do something for the person that caused us harm or hurt or distress or whatever, in this case betrayal, but we can internalize some sense of motivation to forgive for ourselves. And finally, more Oprah, she says, true forgiveness is, this is a challenge, true forgiveness is when you can say thank you for that experience. And I've given this presentation a few times and never have I been able to read that out without thinking, gosh, I don't know if I'm there in forgiveness terms in some of my relationships. You know, could I say thank you for the hurt that you caused to me? Not sure. So I hope that's a helpful kind of context and laying of the foundation in terms of what even is this topic that we're talking about today, what forgiveness is, what it isn't, and where we may be being influenced in our ideas about forgiveness, but also where our clients might be kind of picking up ideas about that too. So when I'm working with my clients, one of the very first things that I'm doing is understanding their definitions of forgiveness. And what does it mean when they say forgiveness? What does that mean, and what does it not mean? And so working with clients to understand their own individual definitions of forgiveness is an important starting place. And kind of understanding, where does that concept of forgiveness come from? So what does it mean to you? What does it really mean to you? Because again, sometimes we throw this word around and we haven't really stopped to think about, well, what do I mean when I say that? What informs that definition? Where am I getting my information about what forgiveness is and is not? I've given some examples here, from culture. What am I seeing on the television and in the media about forgiveness? What are the examples of forgiveness that are being held up? When I think about forgiveness, I often think about, Desmond Tutu, or some of those really amazing spiritual leaders. But I might also think about popular culture. So there's some stuff in there. Lots and lots of my clients are informed by religion and spirituality. What have I learned about forgiveness? What informs my perception of that? And family scripts. What was the messaging in my family? What did I learn about forgiveness from my parents? What was modeled in the home growing up? So just exploring this starting place. And then once we've kind of got an idea of what this individual person understands when they talk about forgiveness, we can then move on to look at, so what does that actually look like in practice? So even kind of right back to the start, thinking about, what are we even talking about with this particular person? Because my guess is that my definition of forgiveness might be slightly different, probably some overlap, but might be slightly different from yours. So just checking in with the chat, I would add that forgiveness has made me a better person. Right, there's a meme right there, isn't there, we could put out on the internet. Question, does forgiveness mostly come from a theist Christian worldview? Well, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking that. I would say that in my experience, many of my clients' views on forgiveness are influenced by, honestly, Christianity in the case of my clients. But I would guess if you were working in a different cultural context, if you were working in a different country, you would equally find cultural and religious influences through the sort of narratives of Christianity, of forgiveness rather. So I think that's why it's really important to start asking questions. When my clients are saying, I'd like to explore forgiveness, I'm like, okay, what does that even mean, as we start to think about that? So yes, absolutely, there are, I think, spiritual influences when we start talking about the topic of forgiveness. Thank you for that question. So starting out, looking at each individual person, what does the concept of forgiveness mean for you? Where are you getting that information? What's informing your perception of that? And what would it look like for you to live that out in practice? Because that's got some real implications, hasn't it? If I believe that forgiveness and reconciliation are mutually inclusive principles, then that's a very different conversation than if I don't, because it means something different. So it's important to define that for yourselves. So, well, why is forgiveness so hard then? Because forgiveness is a hard topic. And now if you're a practitioner in the room and you're like, forgiveness is super easy, then please tell me what I'm doing wrong. Because forgiveness often feels hard and sticky and confusing. And like I said, there's this kind of motivational ambivalence. And so let's have a look at what makes forgiveness so difficult. So I'm going to start here to kind of get into the meat of what I'm sharing. So I'm going to start pulling the principles that I learned out of the research. So this is where you might want to grab a pen. So the very first thing in terms of our starting point that I wanted to share with you came from one of the studies where they started to talk about the types of people who were more predisposed toward forgiveness. And they talked about the balance between what they were calling warmth-based virtues, like compassion, empathy, understanding, and altruism, and conscientiousness-based virtues. So that's their language, not mine. But if I was going to sort of paraphrase that in my own language, I might talk about these as kind of values or principles. And basically the research was saying that if you are more naturally predisposed to warmth-based virtues, you are more naturally likely to experience a desire to forgive. Whereas if you are more naturally predisposed to these conscientiousness-based virtues like responsibility, honesty, accountability, and duty, you are more likely to find that forgiveness is a little bit more difficult for you, because you're going to need something to happen before forgiveness can be possible. So the research said this: in many situations, warmth-based virtues and conscientiousness-based virtues should complement each other. So the example that it gives is that if an offender is sincerely sorry, repentant, and repairs all the damage, then forgiving seems like both a compassionate and a conscientious thing to do. So it would make sense when these virtues are lined up to forgive, when you can have compassion and empathy and understanding for the person who has offended against you, and you can see that they are taking responsibility, being honest and accountable, and I guess doing their duty, then forgiveness is quite an easy, or is an easier thing to consider, because it satisfies both of these kind of virtue systems or value systems within you. It goes on to say, though, that these virtues might clash in cases of serious and uncompensated injustice, and that one might hypothesize that warmth-based virtues would motivate forgiveness or mercy, whereas conscientiousness-based virtues would motivate the pursuit of repayment, punishment, or civil justice. So when both of these pieces are not satisfied, forgiveness becomes more difficult. And depending on your natural leaning towards these warmth-based virtues or the conscientiousness-based virtues, you'll find it either easier or harder to forgive without satisfying both. So I hope that makes sense. And the truth is, at least for my clients, and this is where it becomes a little bit interesting, is that if you look at the things on the right-hand side, they are often responsibility, accountability, honesty. They are often the pieces that are required for successful relationship recovery after betrayal. And many of my female partner clients have a lot of the warmth-based virtues as well. So this is what I'm calling betrayal dilemma number one when we come to this idea of motivational ambivalence. So balancing on the scales, we've got our warmth-based virtues of compassion, empathy, altruism, and understanding, which many of my clients have, and these kind of recovery principles of responsibility, honesty, accountability, and duty. And if and when they are not both satisfied, you'll find that you're weighting towards one or the other will either predispose you for forgiveness or it will predispose you for justice, which is an idea we're going to unpack a little bit more. So this is the first of our scales and the first of our betrayal dilemmas, and you're going to see this slide repeated with the varying things that are in the balance around this topic. So just so you know, that this will serve as a bit of an anchor point for us. So betrayal dilemma number one, balancing out those value systems and virtues. Of course, the question that I get asked a lot from my clients is, will I ever be able to forgive? And as we're sort of starting to look at what's in the balance, I wanted to share with you this quote that I took from Greater Good magazine, which is a hugely helpful mine of information put together by UC Berkeley. So they talked about how forgiveness specifically is contingent upon two types of information: the relationship value of the wrongdoer, now this is their language, and the probability that the wrongdoer will harm us again in the future. It says the combination of these two elements goes a long way to determine whether people are likely to forgive transgressions. And it can also help to explain why apologies on their own can inconsistently lead to forgiveness from others. So let me just unpack that a little bit. So in terms of what's in the balance here, what they're talking about is, depending on how valuable the relationship is with the person who has committed the offense, the betrayal in this case, that will be an important motivation for forgiveness. So if the relationship is really important to you and really valuable to you, you will have high motivation for forgiveness. And to contrast that, the probability that you might get hurt again in the future, especially in the same way, is going to counterbalance that motivation for forgiveness, because we're going to be less likely to want to forgive if we are afraid that we're going to experience that same issue again. So it doesn't take a genius to note that here is betrayal dilemma number 2. So they're already coming thick and fast, aren't they? That here we're balancing off the relationship value of the wrongdoer. So how much do I value this relationship? And usually the answer to that question for my clients is that this is the most valuable relationship that they have. High motivation for forgiveness when the relationship has high value, but balanced off against the risk that this relationship now poses to me, the probability that the wrongdoer will harm us again. And again, for those of you who work in a context around things like sexual addictions, compulsive sexual behaviors, problematic, repetitive sexual behaviors, you're going to intuitively understand the dilemma here that nobody can give a partner client a black and white reassurance that that's never going to happen again. And so the risk is as high, often, sometimes even higher than the relationship value. And so we're looking at balancing these things off against one another. And I hope this is validating for you practitioners what you already know, which is kind of how it was for me. I was like, oh, look, there's some really nice research to back up what I kind of already know. And it just helped me to feel good about having a frame of reference to kind of pin this to. So hopefully this really is validating what you already know. So at this point, we've got 2 dilemmas in the bag already. We've got the warmth and the conscientious values, and then we've got the value of the relationship versus the probability of further harm. So at this point, I want to kind of move into thinking about specifically the forgiveness aversions that I found in that particular study, which is referenced along the bottom of my slide here. I'm going to unpack what this study teaches us about what gets in the way of forgiveness, and it's broken into 3 main areas. So they talked about unreadiness to forgive. And I really liked this language for my clients, because often when we talk about forgiveness, we sort of conversely talk about unforgiveness. And I don't know about you guys, but unforgiveness doesn't feel like a really positive word to me. Or sometimes we'll talk about somebody not being willing to forgive. And so I just appreciated the languaging of this, that we're talking about unreadiness, not unwillingness, not unforgiveness, but that we're just not ready to take a step into forgiveness. And I thought that was a nice, inclusive and validating piece of language for the clients that I work with. Second forgiveness aversion is around self-protection. So this, again, kind of looking at that previous dilemma, this idea that we have to balance forgiveness with the legitimate need to take care of ourselves within an unsafe relationship. And so we're gonna unpack that a little bit. What does the forgiveness aversion of self-protection look like, and how do we help with it? And the last one, which I thought was really interesting, this is their language, is face concerns. So this was about saving face. So one of the aversions to forgiveness is that I don't want to look like a doormat. And they do call this doormat syndrome, or something similar. It's on my slide later on. So one of the things that gets in the way of forgiveness, according to the research, is a fear that other people are going to perceive me as weak or as a doormat, or that I'm going to have that image of myself. So kind of threat to our sense of self-image. And I just thought that was really interesting. So all of that ideas about kind of shame, that people are going to think stuff about me, or I'm going to have a certain type of self-image about myself. So we're going to unpack these 3 forgiveness awareness aversions, and we're going to put them on the scales and see what we've got hanging in the motivational balance. So let's have a look at the barrier of unreadiness. And again, I really liked the languaging around this. So the study defined this unreadiness to forgive as an inner state of unresolved emotional turmoil that can delay or derail forgiveness. And when I think about the clients who present in my office, often in the immediate aftermath of betrayal, this is where they are, in an unresolved state of emotional turmoil. And so we're definitely not talking about forgiveness in the first session. We're not talking about forgiveness sometimes until the 100th session, depending on what's going on. But understanding that unreadiness to forgive is related to the unresolved emotional turmoil. And it went on to talk about rumination as a part of this, saying that people get stuck in a victim loop, ruminating on the wrongs that were done to them by another person or by life in general, and are unable to shift their perspective to a larger view. They're not able to find the meaning, the purpose, the lessons, and the possibilities for change in the event. And so this is where I started to understand the link between forgiveness and the sort of journey towards forgiveness and trauma, and the impact of betrayal trauma. Because we know that trauma comes with rumination. It comes with that re-experiencing those intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, and images. And so the clients that I see absolutely are prone to rumination. They, they can't help but think about, recall, relive, and re-experience the things that they've been exposed to, whether that was stuff that they saw on the computer or whatever that was for them. And so people with trauma are going to find readiness to forgive a little bit more difficult, because they are naturally going to experience more rumination. They're naturally going to need more time to work through that unresolved emotional turmoil. And as I kind of think about what does recovery from betrayal trauma look like, actually, when you get into that stage 2 and stage 3 piece, that's where we're starting to think about things like meaning and purpose and lessons and post-traumatic growth, right? But not here at the start. And so forgiveness readiness is about working through that unresolved emotional turmoil. So this link here between readiness and rumination, and Williamson and Gonzalez, in the study that they did, they found that people's a tendency to be anxious and to ruminate on the severity of the offending behavior was a reliable predictor of unreadiness to forgive. So if you've got a client sitting in front of you who is still caught up in the immediate emotional turmoil, and that, I say immediate, that can take time, probably more time than any of us would like it to take, that's not a good time to be talking about forgiveness, because you can be reliably convinced that they're not going to be ready for that whilst they are still living in the turmoil of the aftermath of betrayal. So people showed more reluctance to move toward forgiveness, especially when they held a fear that the offense would be repeated. So, I just think this is so interesting when working with couples after betrayal, because of course we want there to be trust rebuilt. We want forgiveness to be a thing that we can think about being a part of the story, but we can't ignore the very real impact of trauma and how that impacts the partner's ability to be ready. And we can't ignore the very real fear and risk that the offense could be be repeated. And so here we have betrayal dilemma number 3. And on our scales this time, we've got our client's desire to move forward. So most of the women that I talk to have a motivation to forgive. They have a desire to move forward with the relationship in that way. And balanced against that is the fear that it's going to happen again. And that makes sense, doesn't it? So I'd love to hear if you're following with me in the chat, but hopefully this is making sense to you in the same way that it did to me when I read it. I was like, that makes sense. Doesn't that imply that trust precedes forgiveness? Good question. Yeah, I think you could possibly imply that from that, although we did say, didn't we, that trust and forgiveness may not be mutually exclusive. So I guess the question that you're asking there, Steve, and thank you for asking it, is one that speaks to the context within which forgiveness is taking place, because forgiveness and reconciliation and forgiveness and trust are not necessarily mutually inclusive according to conventional wisdom. And so if you want to recover within the context of a relationship, we know that that is really only possible with the presence of trust. So if you want reconciliation and trust to go hand in hand together, probably that would be an astute observation. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Good spot. And, you know, I will say here, what I haven't had time to do is pull this apart in terms of what does forgiveness look like for people who choose to stay in the relationship after betrayal and for people who don't choose that, right? Because it is, of course, a different story, a different version of the same story, whether you stay and choose reconciliation or whether you don't, or whether reconciliation is even an option for you or whether it isn't. So there's going to be nuance in that journey for sure. Yes, it is the most common question. How do I know they will not do it again, right? And I don't know about any of the practitioners in the room, but I don't have an answer to that question other than to say nobody knows. And I guess this risk is inherent in all relationships, isn't it? But it is front and center in a recovering relationship in a way that it's not for other people. All people are at risk of being betrayed. All people are at risk of something bad happening in their relationship, but they don't have that same level of awareness of it all the time as our clients do. I would add that implies self-forgiveness. Yeah, and again, that's not a topic that I've touched here. I would have loved to have enhanced this to sort of start to think about self-forgiveness, because then you're into self-trust and intuition, which of course is a huge piece of partner recovery too. So yeah, feel free to go read the studies. I did say last time I presented this, maybe we'll do forgiveness part 2, because there is just such a wealth of really interesting information on this topic. So, balancing off our desire to move forward against the fear that it's going to happen again. And with that fear, we encounter the forgiveness aversion of self-protection. So this is all to do with that fear, very often a legitimate fear that forgiveness is going to somehow backfire and leave the person offering forgiveness vulnerable to further harm, aggression, violation of boundaries, exploitation, or abuse. And this is a really important thing to kind of get our head around, isn't it? That sometimes there's a fear of that, and sometimes there's a lived experience of that too. Some of my clients have absolutely, because they have such a strong conviction that forgiveness is an important part of how they live their lives, sometimes they have offered forgiveness without self-protection, without an appropriate level of self-care, and it has backfired on them. You know, they have been left vulnerable to further harm or aggression. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this fear really is a legitimate fear, that offering forgiveness too soon or without the appropriate boundaries, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on too, can leave the person offering forgiveness vulnerable to more stuff happening in the relationship. And so, in terms of where this is most likely to happen, who's this most likely to happen to, the study, and again, this is so relevant for our client base, is that people are most likely to experience the forgiveness aversion of self-protection when they have experienced repeatedly harmful behaviors, and a lack of remorse or apology for that behavior. So those are the people who are most likely to feel resistance to the concept of forgiveness when there's been repetitive harm and when there's a lack of remorse. And of course, if you've got those two things together, then how much more resistance are you going to find? And so that is true for the clients that I see on a daily basis, that often there is repetitive harmful behavior. And the longer that goes on for, we know that that correlates with higher levels of trauma symptoms. And here we get to find out that it also correlates with greater resistance to forgiveness. And couple that with a lack of remorse or apology, and we're really struggling with the idea of forgiveness. And in fact, what they found was even those people who had the strongest motivations to forgive and to maintain a close relationship with the person who they wanted to forgive, even those people could be mitigated by the perceived severity of the offense and or by a perceived lack of apology or remorse. So even those clients who hold forgiveness as a really super high value, even those clients who have very, very strong motivation for forgiveness can struggle with what it really means to forgive when they perceive that the offense against them has been very severe, or that there isn't an appropriate level of remorse or apology alongside it. And here's a quote that I pulled out of the research that I just thought was really interesting. And it talked about how refusal to forgive is really an attempt to kind of recalibrate power and control in the relationship. And when I presented this to the partners in our program, I was careful to say, let's not pull out of this sentence these kind of words that might feel somehow negative, power and control. But let's understand that there has often been a very clear power differential within a relationship where there's been a secret, particularly a long-standing set of secrets. So, you know, the context I'm working in is often chronic betrayal, which comes with a whole bunch of accompanying behaviors, deceptions and gaslighting and kind of double life type stuff. And so not forgiving is often an attempt to somehow recalibrate that power differential that happens within a relationship. And that makes sense to me as I think about the clients that I work with. So I wanted to throw that in there, that part of that self-protection and part of the way that my clients are trying to not be vulnerable to further harm is by holding on to their forgiveness and not offering that in an attempt to recalibrate that power differential. Hope that makes sense to you, the way that I've explained that. So going on in this idea of self-protection, one of the study questions that came out of this is that when we choose forgiveness in the context of a relationship we want to maintain, what they kind of identified is that the core question that we're asking is, can I get my core needs met in this relationship? Or do I have to give the relationship up in order to meet my core needs? And those needs include safety and trust. And again, I thought this was really interesting because safety and trust are, of course, the keys to relational recovery. If a traumatized partner cannot find safety within the relationship, and if we can't find a way to restore trust, then the relationship is likely to either stay dysfunctional and unhappy or to not make it. And so this is really, truly, isn't it, a fundamental question for the clients that we're working with. Just checking in with the chat, holding on seems more like holding on to the need for more trust versus forgiveness, right? And so we're kind of seeing the interplay between these concepts, because safety and trust are foundational to good relationships. And so yeah, and in fact, let me go on to read you this quote, because the clients I work with loved this quote, and it came directly from the research. It's not my quote. So this researcher ended up by saying that the ongoing behavior of the offender is key, that if the hurtful behavior continues, if any sense of wrongdoing is denied, if the impact of the behavior is minimized, if the recipient's sense of self continues to be diminished by the other person, if trust continues to be broken, if the victim continues to be blamed for the offender's behavior, he said if somebody experiences any or all of these factors, then forgiveness can start to feel like an impossible, if not stupid, thing to do. And I just thought that was I mean, it's a pretty blunt statement, right? But it's speaking to the dilemmas that partners are experiencing, that if the behavior continues, and that might be the sexual behavior, or it might be the other relational behaviors that are happening. If that continues, it makes forgiveness seem like an impossible thing. And in some cases, it even feels like a stupid thing to do, to continue to forgive someone who continues to hurt you. And so having, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit at the end, but having information with which to assess the risks in the relationships is super important if we want to even think about forgiveness being an option. How will I determine whether I can begin to move towards forgiveness if I don't know whether any of this stuff is still going on? So I hope that makes sense to you, but I just thought that was a really powerful quote, particularly thinking about the partner paradigm. So it points us to betrayal dilemma number 4, which is our motivation for forgiveness versus our need for self-protection. So we may really, really want to forgive, but we're going to find that almost impossible if we are not able to restore our sense of safety and trust in the relationship, if our needs aren't going to get met within the relationship, and if behaviors are ongoing. So this is the relational piece. So you can see that recovery, that forgiveness rather, is for sure something that you can choose to engage in, but I don't think it is as simple as just making a decision to forgive. There is a relational interplay that's happening according to this research, which I think is really worth understanding. So let's look at the final forgiveness aversion. So they talked in the study about face concerns, or the doormat effect. And I've kind of chosen this picture of the cat looking ashamed because this is about our need to save face in front of other people and to protect our own public reputation, as well as avoiding threats to our own self-concept. So we don't want to feel that we are a pushover, we don't want to feel that we are a doormat, and we don't want other people to think that about us either. And by the way, you know, this is generic research. It's not research that is specifically directed towards the experience of betrayal. So, you know, you could just as easily work with these forgiveness aversions with a client who needs to forgive a parent, or actually some of the research was that was quite interesting around things like grudge theory was directed more at a kind of service type relationship. So there's lots of research about customer behavior in a service environment and how that links to forgiveness. So, you know, this is absolutely a presentation that has wider application besides just betrayal. Just wanted to make sure that we understood that. So, you know, even if, so this week I've recently moved house, and would you believe that my internet service provider has sent 3 separate routers to my old address. So every day this week they've sent a new router to the wrong address, despite me having told them repeatedly that that I don't live there anymore. And that's a kind of a customer service situation where I might experience the forgiveness aversion of face concerns, because I don't want them to think that they can push me around as a customer. So I might be reticent to forgive them in fear that they're going to perceive me that way, and I don't want them to do that. So I'm not going to forgive them. So just to give you a slightly different conceptual or contextual application of this. So the people who are most likely to experience this forgiveness aversion, are people who feel like their self-worth has been diminished by the offence, or who experience a threat to their sense of control or belonging or social reputation, or even feel a need for revenge. So these are the people who are most likely to experience the forgiveness aversion of face concerns. And it goes on to say that to the extent that the victim fears that they may appear weak by forgiving, and that they're concerned with projecting an image of power and interpersonal control, they would feel more averse to the prospect of forgiveness. And again, as I'm reading the research and I'm looking at the context within which I'm working, I can see how this forgiveness aversion shows up in my clients. That when there has been an intimate betrayal, of course, our sense of self-worth is diminished. Of course, somebody is going to feel a lack of control or belonging. There is this wider impact across our clients' relationships, right? They start to question everything that they used to think was true. And so we can see that we may experience with our clients a greater forgiveness aversion linked to face concerns and worries about saving face within the primary relationship, but also within that extended system, right? So what will my mum and dad say if I tell them that he cheated on me and I think and I'm forgiving him for that? What will our broader community say? What will they say at work? What will they say at church? What will they say, at the choir that I attend, whatever that is? So if we are really concerned about the way that people perceive us, especially when our self-worth has taken a hit, then you're going to see a greater aversion to forgiveness. So again, looking at the balance here, the motivational balance, we've got a real desire to let go. Like, I want to move into forgiveness and I feel motivated to do that, but I'm feeling some shame about that. I'm worried about what people are thinking about me. I'm concerned about how I'm going to be perceived, and I'm worried about kind of the negative message that I feel I'm sending about myself. And so you're seeing this forgiveness aversion show up in the balance. Now, what is interesting, on this previous slide, it talked about revenge. So I just want to go back here. So it said people who feel their self-worth has been diminished, or they experience a threat to their sense of control, belonging, social reputation, or feel a need for revenge. And so this was a point in the research where I did a bit of a tangent, because I got interested in this idea of revenge, partly because I have seen a little bit of that in my practice and with the clients I work with. I've seen the odd partner who will have a revenge affair. I've seen some of this stuff, but I generally haven't seen a whole lot of revenge. So I got interested. And what I found in the research was that they were kind of putting revenge and forgiveness on opposite ends of a spectrum. So on one end, we've got forgiveness. On the other end, we've got revenge, and often people are somewhere in between. So as I started to read about this, I came across this concept, which I just thought was really interesting. And I'd never seen this before. So if you've already seen this and you're like, Kat, you're get with the times, then okay. But I'd not seen this before, and I just thought that this was interesting. So negative reciprocity was along the spectrum between forgiveness and revenge. So let's kind of define revenge first, and you'll forgive me for this tangent. Hopefully you'll find like that it's worth it, but I thought this was interesting. So in the research, they talked about revenge is like a disproportional act of hateful violence, and that's not always a person's immediate reaction to perceived injustice. So let me take that off my screen so you don't get distracted by it. So revenge is a disproportionate reaction, where I'm going to kind of retaliate in a disproportionate way. So you step on my toe, I kill you, would be revenge, right? And it talked about using really emotive language, like you wanting to destroy the other person. So that's what we're talking about in terms of revenge. But it talked about this idea of negative reciprocity being a step back from revenge. So saying that we are often angry but not hateful, and we seek a punishment that's short of complete eradication of a rival. So you step on my toe, I kill you, is revenge. Negative reciprocity, though, is where I'm angry but not hateful, and I don't think I need to eradicate you. So it says, unlike revenge, negative reciprocity is a relatively proportional response. So you step on my toe, I step on your toe. That's negative reciprocity. I'm trying to respond proportionately to the harm that you did to me. But here's where I got interested. So negative reciprocity is meant to change the mind of the target, not obliterate it. So you step on my toe and I want you to know that that hurts. So I step on your toe in the hope that in the future you won't do it again, because I need you to understand that that's not okay. And experientially, I'm trying to demonstrate that to you. So I hope that makes sense. So you step on my toe, I say, oh, I don't like that. I do it to you in the hope that you won't do it again. And so negative reciprocity kind of holds the promise of restoring or building cooperation in the relationship. And I just thought this was so interesting when I thought about the way that we approach things like boundaries, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Negative reciprocity is an evolved strategy. It's meant to achieve a balance. So it's seeking to end the injustice and the inequality in the relationship and repair cooperation. So I'm hoping if you step on my toe, that when I step on yours, you'll go, oh, that's not good. That doesn't feel good. I won't do that again. And we'll be back into cooperation and balance and equality in the relationship. And of course, that can go wrong for the clients that I work with. And I do see partners starting here with the idea of boundaries, in the sense that we're kind of in danger of getting stuck in this loop of, you hurt me and now I want you to feel the pain of your choices, which of course is a part of recovery. So you can see it's a nuanced issue. And somehow I'm trying to achieve change in you. That's what negative reciprocity is trying to do. I'm trying to repay your offense with some offending of my own in the hope that you will change. And where that gets dangerous in the clients that I work with is when we get stuck in this feedback loop of, I hurt you, you hurt me, I hurt you, you hurt me, in the hope of restoring change or restoring equality in the relationship. And of course, that doesn't always happen, and it's not the most effective way to get there. So we're going to talk some more about that in just a minute. Let me just check in with the chat. I hope you got what I was saying about negative reciprocity there, because I've struggled with how to explain that in a way that makes sense, but hopefully you got that. If you didn't, chat me. I'm just checking in with the chat for a second. How long do you see parents holding this balance to get to forgiveness of partners? Sometimes a really, really, really long time. And it's really interesting that you asked that question. I get asked a question that sounds like, how long am I going to feel this, whatever this is, fairly often. And the answer I've landed on is longer than you would like. Usually. So in terms of readiness to forgive, there are so many different factors in that, all the stuff that's in the balance, right? All the stuff that's on those scales, relationally and personally. And I'll talk about some of the steps you can take to get there, but sometimes it can take a really long time. And I want you to hear as a partner from me that that's okay. Like, this is a part of your journey, and understanding that unreadiness is a real thing, and that you don't have to be ready until you're ready. I really want you to hear me say that. So all of this research culminated in what the researchers called a forgiveness aversion scale. And they gave these kind of scaling statements, but they were a little bit convoluted. So I tried to turn them into questions because I'm a coach and I love questions. And I thought they might give you something tangible to hold on to with your client. So since we're already at 10 past the hour, I'm not going to spend too long on these, but they are useful to reference. So what I did, as I said, is I took the statements and I turned them into questions, and there are 3 questions for each of the forgiveness aversions, and so these might be useful to you. So in terms of the forgiveness aversion of unreadiness, you can ask, am I having a lot of trouble forgiving because I still feel angry and bitter? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you have the forgiveness aversion of unreadiness. You're not ready. And I want you to hear that as a positive way of assessing, is this something I need to be focusing on right now? If you have the forgiveness aversion of unreadiness, look at what is making you unready and work there, instead of trying to push yourself through to forgiveness. So framing question another way, am I ready to forgive because I'm not ruminating about what happened anymore? And if the answer to that is yes, then you might find that you are more ready for forgiveness. Am I not ready to forgive because I still feel anxious, tense, and upset around my offender? So just kind of pulling out of the research some questions for you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking each of these questions because I think if you are following me, you'll be able to contextualize these against what I've already said. In terms of self-protection, here are some questions. Can I be confident that the offender won't continue to hurt me in the future if I forgive? Really, really tough. So you can see why forgiveness becomes a tough topic for betrayed partners. Am I worried that the offender may think that forgiveness gives him or her permission to do it again? Am I confident that the offender will not take advantage of me if I forgive? So these are kind of boiling down these forgiveness aversions and putting them into questions for you. In terms of face concerns, by forgiving, am I worried that I might appear weak in front of the offender and others? And by the way, that's not my language. And I just really want you to hear me say, I'm not choosing the language in these kinds of questions. So I'm using this word offender because that's the word that's in the research. And so if you're reacting against that word, that's okay. Know that it's not my word, but it's what I came across in the research. Would I be embarrassed by the possibility of letting the offender off the hook too easily? You can see lots of stuff around shame and embarrassment and those self-conscious emotions in this piece. Do I believe that since my offender humiliated me, to show mercy and forgiveness might be too soft on him or her? So just taken from their forgiveness aversion scale, some questions to help you to begin to explore the topic of forgiveness for yourself or for use with your clients. And so hopefully they are helpful for you. So what I hope that you have taken from what I've shared with you so far and understood is that betrayal is a forgiveness dilemma. And you know, you've seen me put the scales up over and over again, and here is what we are holding on our scales. We've got the value of the relationship, we've got our motivation and our desire to forgive and move forward. We've got all of our own values around forgiveness and why that might be important for us. And then we've got that balanced off against fear, those conscientiousness-based values and virtues, a need for self-protection, any shame that we feel about appearing like a doormat, and any risk of further offending within the relationship. So forgiveness is a betrayal dilemma. And just wanted to see it all collected together here. Let me just read the chat. Could self-protection within the context of forgiveness aversion also be a lack of trust or confidence in self to self-protect? Absolutely. For example, will I be able to know if they're offending again? How did I not know what they were doing in the first place? Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing that up. And that's the piece that, if I had time, I might have really unpacked in terms of self-forgiveness and how that links in with things like self-trust. And usually when I talk about that, and I don't know if Galen is in with us today, but my colleague Galen has a quote for every occasion, and I stole from her the quote that she had used from somewhere else when we sort of talk about this idea of self-trust, which is that a bird will land on a branch, not because it knows that the branch won't break, but because that it knows that it has wings and it knows how to fly. And so absolutely it's important to develop self-trust in our clients and in ourselves when that's part of our story too, because we can lean into relational trust and relational stuff when we feel like we can really take care of ourselves and we can trust our intuition. So for sure, that's a good point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. All right, so here's the dilemma. Betrayal is a forgiveness dilemma. So what do we do about it then? How do we do it then? And this is the question that my clients are asking all the time. And so I just wanted to offer, before I get into sharing some ideas with you, I just wanted to offer a word of caution. And this is based on something in the research, but also something I've seen in my own practice. And of course, I'm very British, so I'm calling it sticking plaster forgiveness. You might call it Band-Aid forgiveness. And this is just a word of caution, because one of the quotes that really stood out to me in the research was this one, which said that some people might forgive because they fear confrontation or they want to avoid facing their own anger. It says that philosophers have suggested that forgiveness sometimes can stem from a desire for personal ease or comfort. And I don't love this next sentence, but with such lazy or selfish impulses overshadowing higher goals, such as the maintenance of self-respect or justice. So I translate that to mean sometimes forgiveness feels like the easier option than journeying through all the stuff that can lead to forgiveness. So don't focus on the words lazy and selfish in that sentence. Focus on fearing confrontation, avoiding facing our own anger. Sometimes the stuff we need to get through to get from here to the other end of the idea of forgiveness feels really big and scary, and we'll say, oh, it's okay, and we'll put the sticking plaster of forgiveness over the top of it in an attempt to avoid having to journey that. And if that's you, I get it. It's messy and scary. I get it. And I would be very, very cautious of trying to skip over any of that stuff, because here, just a reminder of the APSAT's multidimensional partner trauma model. In my experience, we get to the kind of fruit of forgiveness in this reconnection stage over here once we've journeyed the other stuff, because we really cannot proceed to forgiveness until we feel safe. So forgiveness is virtually impossible to do, and maybe even stupid, according to the quote from the research, whilst we are not safe. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about some starting points to journey toward forgiveness. Safety first. So developing safety, as I've just said, is a key piece of healing. And here's what you're going to hear from me now, by the way. If you're an APSATS person, or you're familiar with the concept of partner trauma, this is generic trauma stuff, because it truly is my belief that working through the 3 stages of trauma healing is also working through forgiveness aversions, because of all the stuff that I've shared with you. So we're gonna go safety first. Then we're going to start understanding definitions. What does forgiveness mean to this person in front of me at this time? Are there things that forgiveness means and doesn't mean to this person that might be different than my own definitions? And have I taken the time to really understand that before I start to try to work with them around this topic? Does it mean trust? Does it mean reconciliation? What does it mean to this person? And can we explore that together? Take your time when it comes to forgiveness. One of the things that came out of the forgiveness aversions research was the question, so how do we overcome that barrier? And the answer was that for some people, certainly the passage of time can be an important factor in helping people get distance from that initial pain, confusion, and anger. And that time can help the person that needs forgiving to establish a track record of new trustworthy behavior and help the victim to reframe the severity of the injury into the larger context of the entire entire relationship. So those of you who are familiar with relational recovery from a practitioner perspective will know that this is the journey, right? That with time and with the tools and skills that you're teaching to your clients, you're going to create a new track record of trustworthy behavior. You're going to see the partner begin to contextualize these single events into the bigger picture of the entire relationship. So again, you're going to see that this is relational recovery stuff right here. Really important, I think, to identify value conflicts with the client. So we talked a little bit about those virtues and how they play off against each other. Big one that comes up for me with betrayal and values is forgiveness versus justice, which I touched on a little bit. So I wanted to just read this quote from you from a presentation or an article by Rick Reynolds at Fair Recovery, because I think he said it well. He said, all too often we talk about the high price of not forgiving, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and how failing to forgive leaves you forever a victim. We extol forgiveness as a virtue and share examples of those saints who forgave much and show forgiveness as a possibility. And he goes on to say maybe they're an exception, but just by virtue of the fact that we talk about them. He says, but forgiveness isn't natural, especially when it comes to forgiving infidelity. It flows against our basic human nature. For most of us, our initial response to coping with infidelity is justice, not forgiveness. We want restitution, not mercy. We want the scales of justice, and I thought that was helpful, thinking about our scales, to be balanced. And so there really are value conflicts, especially, again, you know, thinking about some of the more religiously minded clients that I work with. They will have strong values around forgiveness and mercy and restitution resolution of this stuff, but they'll also have strong values around justice. And so this is a real place that a values conflict can show up. So get into that with your clients, understand what's going on there, and help them work through those conflicts. There was some really interesting stuff about how we communicate forgiveness. So I'm going to whiz through this to make sure that we don't run out of time. But ultimately, what the research was saying is how you talk about your forgiveness within the context of your relationship makes a difference. So if we express forgiveness in ways that are unassertive, that don't set any limits, that don't have any boundaries, then we can appear that we are condoning or excusing offenses, which can risk future victimization. It also said that assertive and direct attempts to forgive, when we just flat out tell someone, I've forgiven you, that can be problematic too, especially when the person we're trying to offer forgiveness to doesn't think that they need to be forgiven. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? That if I say I forgive you and you don't think that you need forgiveness because you haven't done anything wrong, that can be that can lead to contempt or defense. And so how we choose to talk about forgiveness, when we choose to talk about forgiveness, and how we present that makes a difference to how that plays out in the relationship. In terms of self-protection, really what I wanted to say here is that boundaries are important in the whole conversation about forgiveness. That when we are not sufficiently able to take care of ourselves with the use of healthy and appropriate boundaries, then forgiveness becomes not a very helpful thing to be doing. And here we're back to how boundaries move us away from negative reciprocity. We, instead of getting stuck in this tit for tat, you hurt me, I'll hurt you, in the hope that you will change, boundaries take back the personal responsibility that we each have to maintain our own safety. And so moving away from negative reciprocity into healthy boundary setting. Being aware of the risks, so having a good flow of information within the relationship as it relates to the behavior that has been a problem. So you can't assess the risks if you've got a blindfold on. So you're going to need some information about what is happening in the relationship. So creating a flow of information is really important if we want to be able to forgive, because we can then assess the risks and we can move towards forgiveness. ruminating versus mourning. So rumination is a key indicator of a not ready to forgive position. And so instead of walking in circles, I want to propose that we go on a bear hunt. This is how I usually talk about the process of mourning after betrayal, this stage 2 remembering and mourning. We're going on a bear hunt. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. We can't go around it. We have to go through it. And this is where that sticking plaster forgiveness sometimes shows up, because we don't want to do that because it's hard. And so that is the antidote, I think, to the forgiveness aversion of unreadiness is journeying through the stuff that needs to be journeyed. Healing your self-worth, forgiveness aversion of face concerns here, that if you've got some of that, then what we need to do is strengthen your inner sense of self and self-worth and self-respect, so that your need to save face is diminished, because you feel good about the choices that you're making. You look in the mirror and you see the lion. I'm going to skip through this because I think you're following with me. So healing your self-worth happens really well in group, where people can hold up a mirror and tell you who they see that you are. Self-care is really important for healing self-worth. And often I'm working with my clients to kind of redefine what it might mean to measure up, and understanding, how am I measuring what I believe makes me a worthwhile human being? And then I left this right to the very end. So you'll see why, because of the nature of the discussion that we're having, it would be negligent of me to say that you can forgive without some empathy. So developing empathy for the experience of the person you are seeking to forgive, particularly in a betrayal experience, understanding and learning about them and what their behavioral drivers have been, understanding, listening as they unpack their story, particularly if you're dealing with, chronically problematic sexual behavior, sexual addiction, something like that. Learning to communicate and understand everybody's experience of this can also be super important if we want to move towards forgiveness. And I think that's it. So if you would like to put anything in the chat to tell me what you're taking away, that would be super helpful.
From Raymond, who says, how does this data apply to self-forgiveness, brackets forgiving self? Also, can these slides be made available to the class participants?
So yes, I will very happily make my slides available. I'm not sure if SASH already have them or not, but if they don't, I'm happy to provide them. And of course, and I would say, Raymond, first of all, I don't have time to answer that question fully. Secondly, I haven't fully researched that myself in terms of how it applies to self-forgiveness. So feel free to come back to SASH next year and tell us what you find out, and go have a read of the research. What I had to do to pull this together was take what I was reading and just think about my context and how I saw what I was reading applying there. So I don't have a full answer to that question. It's definitely something I'm going to spend some time researching some more, but if you beat me to it, feel free to come and teach me about it, because I don't have all of that quite yet. But thank you so much for your question, and I'm sure there is some super interesting stuff to say about that.
Kat, I've got a pretty major question that's been sent in here by Jill. She sent it to the panelists, so the other attendees won't be seeing it. Would you like me to read that to you?
Yeah, please.
And everybody can hear it, and then give it a quick attempt to answer. It's quite a long one.
Okay.
She says, she's just posted two, but I'll read the first one. How would you address an issue where a client isn't resistant to forgiveness because they feel pressured to forgive since it's the right thing to do, or maybe they have a hard time validating their own emotions, but you get the sense that real healing or forgiveness hasn't happened? For example, I'm currently seeing a couple where the male partner left the relationship and their 2 children 8 years ago for another woman after a long-term affair. He returned 4 years ago and are now in counseling to address their sexual desire discrepancy issues. They never sought counseling to address the breach of trust, and when asked, they said they just moved on as a way to cope with infidelity and betrayal. How do I tell them essentially healing has not happened?
Yeah, what a great question, Jill. Sticking plaster forgiveness, right? That I don't really want to do the messy, scary, painful work of working through that. And so forgiveness provides a nice sticking plaster over the top. We'll just move on, like you said here. And so that, there's a lot I don't know about that client. I think I definitely do see this in the clients that I work with. And so what I try to do is just hold that with them as they talk about the present relationship and gently explore what that might be about for them. And so rather than sort of saying, I don't think you've forgiven or I don't think you've healed, I'm trying to create a space in which they can identify that for themselves. And so I'm sure that you're already doing that. I know that it can feel really tricky, especially if you've got clients who have a tendency to spiritualize. So I sometimes work with clients from a faith-based perspective, and they've often internalized beliefs about what it means about them if they don't forgive. And so even though you're saying maybe she doesn't feel pressured externally, my guess would be that sometimes there is kind of that internal pressure. So yeah, I think just holding the space and being willing to explore where is that current discomfort coming from, and creating an opportunity for the client to track that back for themselves. And usually in my experience they get there without me having to tell them, because sometimes when I start saying, well, I think this, that's when I will encounter some of that resistance, especially if that detracts something from their sense of who they are, right? So if I see myself as a really forgiving person and I'm using sticking plaster forgiveness, but I don't really think about it that way, and you come in and tell me, well, you haven't forgiven, that can then create face concern, right? That I'm now feeling judged by you, that you are making some kind of judgment on me. So I would say that's a caution. Close, I just wanted to make you aware of the work that we're doing at nakedtruthrecovery.com because it may be useful to you as you're navigating this. So we are operating 3 recovery programs, all online. Our heart being that we wanted to make good quality support and education available that was accessible, anonymous, and affordable. So for partners in healing from sexual betrayal, we operate our Wholehearted Partner Program, which runs on a subscription basis. So you pay a monthly subscription fee of either 40 or 60 Great British pounds, which I translated into dollars for you, which is 53 or 76 per month. So just internalize that. That's less than $80 per month. And you get access to 6 weekly support groups, a monthly educational webinar just like this, where we tackle all of the big topics in sort of healing from betrayal. We also run topic groups that unpack the learning from the webinar. And sometimes we run workbook groups as well. So you can access all of that on a subscription. And then we run a very similar program, whole life recovery program for men seeking recovery from problematic sexual behaviors. Again, running that on a subscription basis to give as much flexibility as we can. So you pay a monthly fee and you can access all of the different support options that we have, so that if you need to change one week because you're traveling or whatever, that's there too. And all of our support has a relational recovery focus and a trauma aware perspective. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that we're there, and you can reach me, kat@visibleministries.com, if you need any more information about those things, and you can find us at nakedtruthrecovery.com.